let's go back to looking at the sample. And here we have a couple of forms that show how we can actually create connections to SQL Server and to an Access Jet database. Here, to connect to SQL Server, we simply have the data source and the database name. In this case, we've sort of defaulted to the one we're using, SQL Express and Northwind. And security, just like in our builder, can either be integrated security, where we're using Windows authentication, or if I click SQL Server Security, then it'll allow me to type in a username and password. But we're using integrated security, which is what Microsoft recommends that you use. It is a stronger form of security than using SQL Server logins. So I can connect now, and we're creating a little grid here just to show us some of the properties of this connection that we've created. So the connection object has a connection string property, and we can see that connection string that we automatically generated. And then here's a connection timeout value. This is how long it's going to try to connect before giving up. The name of the database, the data source, packet size, the server version, and so on. Some of these have been filled in for us automatically. The state of a connection is something that can change, right, between open and closed. And in fact, there is an event that runs anytime a connection state changes. And so when I click this button, we're going to hook that event up. And notice we have a message box that is running in the event, showing us the original state closed and the current state open because it changed when we just opened the connection here. And now we see the information about the connection, and when I close this, the event will run again because we closed the connection, and here it's showing us the original state open and the current state closed. So if you need to monitor whether a connection is open or not, you can do that using this event handler. Now, before I look at that code with you, let's go ahead and run the example that connects to Access. Now, if you've ever worked with Microsoft Access MDB databases, you know that there are a couple of different security models that are supported. You can have a completely unsecured database, in which case all you really need is a path to the MDB file for your data source. Or you can have user-level security, where you need to specify both a path to the database and also a path to a workgroup file that has an MDW extension, and these are the ones that we're using in our sample. If I click here, I can, type in something else if I've moved it or whatever. And you also need a user ID and password, which we have here. And then there's something called just a database password, where you're essentially putting a password on the file the way you might put a password on a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet. And so here is another way. And I'll just have to mention to you that this access security is not something you should rely on. It's a deterrent, but all of these have been cracked, and you can go on the internet and in 10 minutes you could download a tool that they might charge you $10 for if you don't find the right site, and that'll allow you to defeat all of these various forms of security. So, if you really need secured data, we recommend that you use SQL Server or some other server-based data engine, but Access does provide some deterrence, and really this is just an example of the different kinds of settings that you can use in creating connections for different data sources. So here, for example, with the database password, I can connect, and now we're looking at the properties for this connection. In this case, it's an OLEDB connection, and you see here that we're showing that many of the same properties are supported. And here's a provider that's a little different, because when we're working with OLEDB, there can be different providers, and here we happen to be using the provider for Jet. And if I click up here, we're also going to be able to connect, and in this case, the data source is this database that wasn't secured, and the connection string is going to be a little bit different. Here you can see that this connection string just has the path to the database as the data source and the provider. Those are the only two pieces of information we need, whereas for user-level security here, we also need to supply the path to the MDW file. So that's called JetOLEDB System Database. So you have all these different settings that are required depending on the data source that you're using, and you can use the connection builder to generate a connection string, or you can just type in a connection string yourself and use that to configure the connections that you're creating. The code for all of that is pretty simple. We'll take a quick peek at it. So here is the form that we opened for SQL Server. And if we look at the code, you can see that when I clicked on the button, we are using a connection string builder here, and we are simply setting the properties based on the values in the text box. So using this connection string builder is really the safest way because you're not dealing as much with having to get the strings right, you know, and so it's safer code in a way to just be able to hit dot and choose the property that you want instead of typing in the connection string yourself. And, you know, we're just grabbing the values from the form. Here is the data table that we created in order to display information about the connection. And so here our data table is going to be generated by a procedure here called SQL Client Connect, where we pass in the connection string, and let's just jump to this by using GoToDefinition. Here's that SQL Client Connect. You can see we pass in a connection string, and then we open up a new data table, and using a new SQL connection that we create using the connection string that was passed into us, right? Then we have instantiated the connection, and we call connection.open. Now, I want to point out to you this using statement. That's very important. When you're working with resources that you want to be sure are disposed of properly, you can work with the resource using this using statement, and you may be familiar with that already. And what this is essentially the same as is creating a try finally block where we will try to open this connection, and then if anything goes wrong, it will automatically in the finally block run code that calls the dispose method of our connection. And even if things go perfectly right, that finally block, which is hidden from us here, will automatically run calling dispose on the connection. So anytime you have an object that has implemented this iDisposable interface, meaning it has a method called dispose, you can use using, and in this way we'll be assured that our connection is going to be closed when we're done working with it. You don't want to leave connections open because even though the variable may go out of scope, the connection will stay open for a while until the garbage collector happens to kick in and run the finalizer for that connection. You want connections to be closed as soon as possible. We'll talk more about that when we talk about connection pooling. All right, so getting back to the code here, we call connection.open, and then we're simply adding some columns to our table, 2 columns that are going to be for the property and setting. And then we populate a series of rows here in our data table, and you'll learn more about how to create rows in a data table later on when we focus on that, but we just add these rows to the data table to show the value of these various properties of the connection. Connection.connection string, connection timeout, and so on. We just picked a few interesting properties to show. So that's what's going on there for SQL Server. How about in our access example, we have a separate form, and the code is, you know, kind of similar. The only difference is that we had those 3 different types of connections that we were able to handle depending on the security model that was used. But notice we have here a string provider name equals, and we have here the JET OLEDB40 provider. You need to specify a provider when you're working with the OLEDB.NET provider. And then basically just, depending on the various options that were used, which radio button was checked, we're going to create our connection string so that it has the provider equal to the value that we set up for our provider is going to be filled in at the end here. And then data source equals. And then in this case, we're adding that system database, which is the MDW, and user ID and password. And here's where we fill in those tokens, those 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 tokens, either taking information that we created in a variable or taking information from the various text boxes on the form. And here's where we actually create the new connection by using the connection string that we're generating, and then we open the connection and display the properties as we saw before. So this part is relatively easy. Working with connections is not difficult. Basically, you just instantiate a connection, you give it the right connection string, that's your only obligation, and then you open the connection and close the connection. And other than that, just to be safe, use a using statement where if you neglect to close the connection explicitly, you can be assured that any open connections are going to be closed for you automatically.